Have you ever imagined a world, well, fill in the blank. SparkHub is about making dreams happen when life throws major curveballs at you. It's my hope that any time you listen to an episode, something will spark inside of you, and even if no one listens, but I leave some kind of legacy time capsule behind for my children that may even spark them to imagine their own great world after I'm gone, well, that's good enough for me. Below each episode are crucial show notes, and please support us by visiting thesparkhub.com. Now, let's begin. My name is Allan, and I have a heck of a story for you. I imagine that everyone at, some stage in their life is asked the question if they have a soulmate. And if they do, how do you find them and where are they? And it's kind of like a question to the universe, I guess. And in this episode, you hear about something I set up in 2006 called areyoumywife.com. It's a .com, but it's also a question. And it was sort of my own search for the answer to the question everyone asks. It started a little bit as a campfire dare in the prairies of Canada. And then I ended up going around the world on dozens of dates in about a dozen countries over the span of a year. And all of it was fueled by the kindness of strangers and legacy media. So I guess it's always complicated. If my kids ask, how did you and mommy meet? Or if someone asks me at dinner, how did you meet your wife? It's, well, how long you got? Answer. So spoiler alert, just under 2 decades after the event you're about to hear, I'm now divorced with 2 children. And in many ways, I'm starting over, and a lot has changed. But for today, I'm going to look back and tell that story, the I My Wife story, the question, including the prequel events in my life that led up to it, and then there's the aftermath. Okay, so I'm kind of nervous for many reasons. This is the first episode of SparkHub I've done in a very long time, under a different idea, and this one will be on my own. I'm hoping to get guests at some point, but I'm sort of shaking off the cobwebs after experiencing some massive curveballs in life. And full disclaimer, everything I'm about to discuss, the whole story I'm about to tell, it's my own story, my own opinion. SparkHub's not a soapbox. It's not a way to bash people. It's an ongoing conversation. So I'm not aiming to disparage or represent any of my exes or my children. This is just my own experiences. So just wanted to say that up front, and maybe the place to start in understanding how I got to launching a website called areyoumywife.com is to talk a little bit about my parents, because that's where we all begin, isn't it? And in brief, my parents came, well, my mother's Danish and my father's English, and they emigrated to Canada in the 60s, where they built a life from scratch, more or less. And during that time, they had loads of adventures, including buying a Volkswagen Westfalia and traveling all around North America and South America for just shy of 2 years. And I guess you can really get to know someone, a life partner, I suppose, if you travel in a Volkswagen with them and take on the world. And so I suppose that's where I came from. And as soon as I was brought into the world, I think there's a picture of me in a canoe at 6 months old. And then that followed a great life in Canada growing up, as well as other places, but we'll come to that another time. I'll fast forward to my college years and my university years that were, I guess, from the age of, say, 18 to 23, back to back. I went to school and worked full time. And so by the age of 23, I was working in the Canadian Rockies with my brother Simon. We did a big US road trip, and then I traveled for several months to land in Australia, where I lived for 18 months before coming home to Montreal and living in my parents' basement, trying to figure out what to do next with my life. I'm fortunate enough to have 2 passports, one British, one Canadian, so I thought it would be good as a young man of, I suppose, 28 or 29 years old at the time, to move to London, the big smoke, one of the world's global cities. I was thinking at the time I'd live a couple of years and then go somewhere else. I'd sort of, I guess, swimming upstream from my dad and my mom, who came over from the UK to Canada in the 60s. But let's see, life happens when you're making plans. So I sort of swam upstream. I went back to the motherland thinking I'd be there for a couple of years. And the first thing I noticed when you get to London is, well, there's an expression, a man who's sick of London is sick of life. But I found that it was 4 times as small as where I grew up and 4 times as expensive. And that was fine. It was an exciting, dynamic city to be when you're young. You can certainly cut your teeth. But my biggest challenge at the time was dating. Dating in the big smoke, the search for true love in the big smoke, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. And I tried online dating. Now, just to date this goes back to 2006-ish. And so this is pre-Facebook and pre-iPhone, pre-social media, or at least social media in the way we know it now. So dating sites were kind of clunky back then. And I probably still are now, but I just found, to cut a long story short, I didn't find that it was, I guess, dating sites weren't incentivized to help you find love. They were incentivized to keep you subscribed and paying money in the hope that you would find love. And there's all kinds of things wrong with that business model, emotionally and I suppose financially. So there I am in the big smoke, big city, big life. And then something happened, and maybe it was a sign. About 3 months before I left to move to London, a friend of mine named Kyle was doing something called One Red Paperclip. So he'd set up a website, a blog, and he put a paperclip up, and he said he was willing to go anywhere in the world to trade for an object that was bigger or better, and he'd like to keep trading until he got a house. He wanted to avoid having to save money. He'd rather use a method of trading to get to a house. And so his adventure began, and for the first 3 months, I collaborated with him in a limited way. I did some photography. We went to the States together, and I watched him trade. And by the time I moved to London, I think he was up to a keg of beer or something like that, and I followed the blog like everyone else did. It gained some celebrity notoriety, it gained some media attention, but I was living in London trying to find my own way in the world. One advantage I did have is my dearly departed brother Simon at the time was working for Air Canada, and so he was able to give me these buddy passes that I could use, and for about £50 I could jump on a plane headed anywhere as long as there was spare seats. You had to go on standby. So Kyle rings me up and he says, Allan, you never believe it. I've got a house in Saskatchewan, and there's going to be a big media fair, and there's going to be a big trade where we're going to trade for a role in a movie. And I said, Kyle, I started this with you I started with you. It's his project, but I started the journey with him. So yeah, there's Kyle calling me saying he's got a house of all places in Saskatchewan, Canada. And so I jumped on one of my brother's buddy flights and I flew out to Saskatchewan, and it was a huge media affair. Kyle had done it. He's gone from a paperclip to a house in less than a year. And on top of which, when all the cameras were rolling and he was celebrating his final trade to the fanfare of the media, he got down on one knee, bent the paperclip into a ring, and proposed to his girlfriend in front of the whole world. And it was one hell of a moment. And I was there and I witnessed it, and I was proud to have been associated to it in a limited way, but Kyle had done it. And later that night, we were all sitting around a campfire in Saskatchewan, and it was in the afterglow of Kyle's achievement. He'd got a house. He was about to get a wife. And we were sitting around, and Kyle said to me, Allan, what's your biggest problem now that you live in London, UK? And I said, it's dating. It's online dating. I don't like it. It just doesn't reveal someone's true character. It feels like a game that's rigged against you, like a casino. And he dared me. He said, well, I did One Red Paperclip. Why don't you do Are You My Wife? Go around the world with your airline passes and just see what happens. And we kind of talked about it in a bit more detail. And then I got back on the plane and headed back to London. And I thought about it and I said, why not? What have I got to lose? So I set up a blog called areyoumywife.com, and someone else owned the domain at the time, but that's a whole other story, which I'll talk about another time. I got the domain off that person and I launched the website. And I put my photo at the top, my phone number, and my email, which was areyoumywife@gmail.com. And I said there were 3 options. I would really like to meet someone, but you can either ask me out on an interesting date. You can ask me to ask you out on an interesting date if you give me a few details about yourself. Well, you don't have to date me, 3rd option, but you can offer support. And I didn't mean financial. I just mean, I don't know, ideas, a place to stay or whatever, and see what happens. And so I threw it up there and almost forgot about it, except that Kyle was like, Allan, I can't believe you've done it. He then put a link to Are You My Wife on One Red Paperclip, and he had tons of web traffic and media attention, and suddenly the spotlight shined on me. And within a day of him doing that, I'll never forget the morning after he'd done it, and he didn't tell me, and I had thousands of emails sitting in that inbox. And I just remember sitting there like not believing my eyes, because the inbox count kept going up like by hundreds every second. Unread email, ping, 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 like a gambling machine. Now, once I got into it, it was a mixture of spam, haters, well-wishers, interview requests, publishers, and in there were some legitimate date requests or women saying, and men too, by the way, saying, hey, why don't you come meet me and we'll do something. And what was interesting is I had a job at the time, a Monday to Friday job at a marketing agency. And I would wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. I'd clear the inbox as much as I could or try and save emails to read later. And sometimes I would get invited to do daytime TV. Then I'd go to work. Then I'd do radio shows on my lunch break by phone. And then after work, I'd do newspaper interviews. My work colleagues thought I was nuts when they found out. And I also lived in a house at the time with a house share in Walthamstow, East London, and I had 3 other roommates who suddenly, well, they just never saw me again. Fast forward, this became so busy, I ended up quitting my job, and I just put everything on my credit card and trusted it would all work out. I mean, it was a big risk. It felt right at the time, and I figured if Kyle could get a house and a wife within a year and with a blog and some interesting stories, why couldn't I? Why couldn't I? So there you go. My wife became a full-time job, paying nothing and guaranteeing nothing, and frankly, just testing all my skills, including survival. And just to zoom out to 10,000 feet, I guess I would end up going to 13 countries on about 53 dates, and that varied from coffees to jumping out of a plane to meeting people in costumes and catacombs and attending a bachelor and spinsters ball in the desert, and actually a whole lot more. And so I suppose there's so many branches and dates to this story and twists and turns. There's too much for me to tell in one episode, but maybe over time on SparkHub I'll do flashback episodes and go into specific events and really what they meant to me at the time and what they mean to me today. So to follow. But during the madness, during all this craziness, I did end up meeting, well, I met someone amazing in my own backyard back in London. And we met via Ari, my wife, but it was because it was featured in something called The Metro, which is a free newspaper that's distributed on the London Underground. And I don't remember the stats, but millions of people use the London Underground every day to go in and out of London. And I was featured on page 3. So you see the cover, you open the cover, and I was a full page spread. And that's where my ex first saw me and got in touch, followed my blog, and it went from there. And there's a book I once read called The Alchemist by, I think it's Paul Coelho, that says when you leave your own backyard or you leave your own garden, you return to it to admire its beauty. And I felt that was true. That was true. That's what happened to me. Ari, my wife, more or less ended in Australia. That's where I sort of decided to stop. And by then I'd met my ex. I then made my way back to the UK via Thailand and the United Arab Emirates to continue dating who became my wife, who became who I would eventually propose to. And in hindsight, that almost didn't happen because months before the Australia thing, I almost shut remywife.com down because it had really strayed into the territory of like fame-seeking gimmick, sort of bachelor territory, like a TV show type thing. And that was never the point. I wasn't interested in that. And you know what? There's a whole bunch of stories I'll tell around that. But I did meet someone amazing. And after we both started dating and both started with very little financially and in terms of living in a small apartment in London, we built a life together from that point forward. And that included property and children and businesses. But before we get there, I suppose it's also worth mentioning that not long after we got together, there were approaches and discussions with agents and publishers and producers who wanted to turn the blog into a book, a movie, a series, a TV format, a dating site, just lots of that. And I remember at the time feeling conflicted, but also mesmerized by the opportunity, because if I could turn it into something that my new partner and I could live off of and, not have to do jobs. It's very tempting. It's I guess the lure of not showbiz, but it's just the lure of the creative life. And I think that was fine. But once you did the math on how much you'd actually make or decent money to reach that level, just to sell a book where you only made 50 cents a copy and you had to pay back the advance as an example, it just didn't make financial sense. I almost calculated at the time that getting a job at Subway would pay more and was more lucrative. So I think a lot of that stuff fizzled out, and there's reasons for that, which I might go into in another episode. But there's an interesting twist to that thread, which is that I started to look for work. I was young, I just met someone, and I certainly wasn't going to not pay the bills because that's very unattractive. And I started a fledgling career in marketing, so I decided to pursue marketing agency. And interestingly, as I interviewed for roles, I kept getting asked for roles because people actually looked at my CV where I had to put remywife.com for a year because that's a year gap in my CV. And they invited me in to talk about it. And as the more and more I talked about what I did, the more and more these companies were saying, wow, these skills are valuable. You can produce content, you can write, you can film, you can edit, and at this time social media and Facebook had started kicking in, so you know how that works and you know how to moderate comments. So I became this Swiss Army knife marketing guy through that story, and that was the value. It generated job interviews, and I was more or less, once I was in the door at a market, I got a my first gig at a small boutique marketing agency. Within 7 years, I was at a very senior level at a global marketing agency. So that was a result. And it allowed me and my ex to dream a little and have some money in the bank and get some homes and go on some nice holidays. And it was a wild ride. And as I look back, I have a sense of pride. A campfire dare turns into this global quest and I meet somebody. It's wonderful. But I also look back in sadness at all the things that never happened that we didn't get to do. And part of that is down to global circumstances. And now here I am, telling you this story at the age of 46. I started it when I was 29. And my ex and I are amicably divorced, but we're still living together in the beautiful house that we built together outside of London in the countryside until we can sell it. We have 2 beautiful children, and in many ways, I'm almost, I suppose, boomeranging back to where I started. I don't know if there's a correlation to Australia there, but I'm boomeranging back to before I and my wife, wondering what love looks like, what life looked like, what work looks like. Will I ever see it again? What adventures are coming next? Hey, what was that question I asked at the start? Is there a soulmate out there? We all think it, don't we? Is there such a thing as true everlasting love? I'm really proud of what I did with Ari, my wife, and the stories that resulted, and having the privilege to marry someone, to have a wedding, to have children. All of that's really, really, really priceless. But God, how much the world's changed since Ari, my wife. I've seen so many copycat acts, especially now on social media. And these recent years have been tough. I've had a lot of support in these tough times from so many people I'm now proud to call friends. And it feels like a long time since I sat around that campfire in Saskatchewan in the afterglow of the Ari, my wife story and took on a challenge to find love. And actually, I don't even know what happened to the One Red Paperclip House. I sort of lost touch. I know Kyle put out a book. I think I mentioned in it, and he went on some speaking circuits, and a movie got optioned but never made. But I've sort of lost touch. And now, instead of a campfire, I'm very often sitting in a pub with my current friends, and a lot of them, when they hear this story, or they say, hey, you got to hear Allan's story, because clearly once I tell someone, they seem to think it's worth telling to others. They come up with funny website names now. Hey, why don't you do it again? Are You My Wife Too? The Aftermath, the follow-up, and, maybe even call those newspapers back and do a follow-up piece. But I think the whole landscape's changed. Now, I'm told, I haven't gotten into this yet, but I'm told you can date by swiping people with your thumb. You can dismiss them with a gesture on your pocket computer. And that didn't exist when I launched Are You My Wife? That was barely born, the iPhone, and I was blogging and doing media interviews. What does it look like in a TikTok world? I don't see anyone, come to think of it, reading the metro anymore on the train. And that's where my first connection happened that opened all those doors. Now there's TikTok, there's podcasts, which I'm doing. And there's huge generational differences between even people 10 to 15 years older or younger. Now there's even artificial intelligence, which is a whole other kettle of fish. And I guess I'm scared, to be honest. I'm scared as I think about it for me and my kids and my ex too. I've lost a lot of confidence, I think, in the past few years. And I'm less sure about what my comfort zone is anymore. And I used to just color outside my comfort zone without thinking. But now I have to think. There's other people that depend on me. So here I am. I've mustered the courage to start this hub where I plan to tell stories and talk to people and put it all out there. And if only even just my children listen to these episodes years from now as a time capsule, and just to know what I was going through while they were growing up, that's ideal. That's ideal. I'm happy with that. But who knows what else might spark? I guess we'll see. Thank you for listening. To support SparkHub, please have a look at the show notes below this episode, or visit thesparkhub.com to sign up for our newsletter, which offers exclusive inside scoops. Just quickly, the music you're hearing is composed by Shi Hao Yan, and the audio engineering is done by Emily Chung. My name is Allan, and I hope that you dream big and something sparked in you today.